Hello everyone, this is part 14 of What If Naruto Was Abused and Leaves Konoha, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Despite the cold and rather uncomfortable ground, Tayuya had to admit that it was a good sleep. She felt lighter today, as if a gravity seal had been released from her body after too many years of being active. Honestly, even she couldn't tell when it was she had started to like Naruto in that way. It was more of a gradual thing. Even so, she was always far too stubborn a person to ever admit such things. She couldn't be sure if Naruto finally finding out was a good thing, but something inside her told her it would be interesting to find out. She looked up from her position resting on his chest and stared up at his dozing face, gently reaching out a hand and lightly brushing it against one of his whisker marks. Ever since she had met him, they had fascinated her, making her wonder what they felt like. She found it odd when they didn't actually feel any different from the rest of his skin. They were slightly smoother like the area around her curse mark, but they weren't raised or grooves like she would have thought. A smile graced Naruto's face when she brushed one of them and he chuckled. She could feel the vibrations through the contact with him and it made her smile as well. Quickly she stopped stroking him, realizing how it might look if he woke up to her doing it. That in itself made her pause. How would it look? She was now his girlfriend. Did girlfriends do things like that? She didn't honestly know she was as new to all this as Naruto was himself. It seems her stroking had actually gotten to the boy and he stirred before blinking his eyes open. Hey Tayuya. She smirked back at him. Hey shithead. Naruto groaned but still smiled. So you're still going to call me that? She sat up with her arms crossed under her chest while pouting in a very Tayuya fashion, mainly in a mocking gesture. Until the day I drop. Naruto chuckled as well, but she didn't miss the frown that troubled his features when she said that. He sat up as well, looking out over the village and only just noticing the sun beginning to fall in the sky. Damn, how late did we sleep in? Tayuya just shrugged, not really caring, as she figured the later the better. Anko would probably be pissed and would no doubt punish them with training, not to mention tease the hell out of them when she found out, but a small part of Tayuya knew it was worth it. Dunno, come on, we should probably go find Gaara before he gets frustrated and takes it out on some unsuspecting building. Naruto nodded but suddenly smirked as he looked across at Tayuya. What are you looking at? His smirk grew. You just said an entire sentence without swearing. Tayuya thought back and realized he was right. What? Fuck off, I didn't. Go shove your fucking head up your shitty ass. Naruto just chuckled while Tayuya blushed, both getting to their feet, but before they could take off, Naruto put a hand on Tayuya's shoulder. Tayuya. She looked around, noticing how deeply in thought Naruto looked. What do we do now? She frowned at him. What do you mean? I said we're going to find Gaara. He smiled weakly, shook his head and motioned with his hand between them. No, I mean with us. What do we do now? Tayuya suddenly blushed as she remembered some of the things Temari had talked to her about, Jiraiya's perverted books supplementing that. I don't know. Naruto nodded his head in agreement. They really hadn't thought that far ahead. I guess we just keep doing what we normally do. If it feels right, I don't see why we should change it. Naruto nodded again, his smile gaining more confidence as he agreed with Tayuya's sentiments. However, if he could, there was one thing he would like to change, and to illustrate that he suddenly leant forward and captured Tayuya's lips with his own. The redhead's eyes opened wide as she felt the urge to fight against the action, but her own words flashed through her mind. She realized that this felt, in a word, right. She closed her eyes and leaned into the kiss a bit more, but Naruto chose that moment to break from it, leaving Tayuya frowning. She opened her eyes to see Naruto smiling playfully at her, making her scowl. Why'd you stop, shithead? He shrugged and leant forward again, but she stopped his face with her hand, this time leaving him confused. She would be damned if he was the dominant one in this relationship. She gave him a mischievous wink before disappearing in a shunshin, leaving behind a dazed and confused Naruto. Women can be troublesome. He could have sworn he heard a cacophony of men sneezing coming from a particular house not far away, but shrugged it off as his imagination. He hopped down off the monument, taking his normal shortcut but with an enormous grin plastered across his face. Tayuya laughed to herself for leaving Naruto high and dry, but he deserved it for breaking the kiss too early. He really was going to have to learn about these things, and Tayuya decided it would be better if she weren't the one constantly correcting him. To her it was a sort of test, and while she had her doubts about Naruto, she knew he would probably meet her expectations. After all, she had gotten him into those books for more than the pleasure of reading. If he didn't come away from them without any hints, then he was a hopeless case. Despite her earlier sentiments of finding Gaara, she found she actually rather felt like being alone right now. She chose a random direction and started walking, not particularly caring where she ended up. It didn't even cross her mind when the streets began to get emptier and emptier until there was nobody but her walking through the barren walkways. She did notice all the strange fan symbols that littered the walls, though. They made her wonder if she had somehow stumbled into some kind of clan compound. That didn't make much sense to her, as if that were true then there should be more people walking about. It was at that moment she realized that she was the only person in about 100-meter radius. She couldn't see another living soul, and the streets were quiet and had obviously been vacant for some time. The place gave her the creeps, and she turned around to leave and possibly find Naruto when she heard some commotion from the largest building in the area. Her curiosity piqued, she made her way over to where she could hear voices and see lights. She hopped over a wall to see the strangest sight. The Uchiha kid from the Chunin exams was facing down 4 people, all dressed in the same ridiculous clothing. It was some kind of cream robe with a white yin-yang symbol, and for a belt they wore a thick purple rope wrapped in a pretzel knot at their back. She would have snorted from the idiocy it would take to wear such a uniform, but she didn't want to give her position away. There was a fat one with a bright orange mohawk, clearly the up-close and personal type. Next was a strange thin person who Tayuya couldn't tell was male or female due to the green lipstick and pale blue hair. They were distinguished by a strange lump on the back of their neck that looked like a second head. The strangest of them was a dark-skinned man with 6 arms, something Tayuya found incredible. Lastly, and possibly most shocking, was one of the members of that girl Hinata's team, the one Naruto fought in the preliminaries. Tayuya crept closer to hear what they were talking about with Sasuke, not noticing as her foot lightly brushed a near-invisible wire. Before she could even shout out in surprise, she found herself enveloped in some kind of fast-hardening gunk. Horrifically, she realized it was shot out from the 6-armed guy's mouth, which made her want to vomit. Sasuke and the uniformed ones all turned to look at what he had caught. The androgynous on with the lump jumped up next to her and stared down at her with a sneer. Looks like Kidomaru caught a little fly on the wall. Now identified as a man by his voice, he chuckled to himself before noticing the curse mark, only half hidden by Tayuya's shirt. Oh, and what's this? Aren't we lucky? He picked her up with surprising strength and carried her back down to his teammates. What is it, Saken? It was the fat one who asked, and Tayuya shot him a scowl, finding she instantly disliked him. Fuck off, fatso. The ginger-haired behemoth gained a tick over his eye and started to march forward, his hands already curled into fists. Back off, Jirobo, this is the one Lord Orochimaru told us to watch out for. Jirobo scowled at Tayuya before backing off, at least that told Tayuya that Saken was the leader of the group. By now the Uchiha just looked impatient, tapping his foot irritably, making Tayuya wonder what he was doing with subordinates of Orochimaru. Will you idiots just stop bickering so we can go? Tayuya tried not to show her surprise at Sasuke's defection, to Orochimaru of all people. Oh great, you're a fucking traitor. Should have known an emo fag like you would want to be butt buddies with Orochi pedo. Sasuke scowled at her, striking her across the face with the back of his hand in anger at her outburst. Tayuya by now was furious, but before she could retort, Kidomaru sprayed some more of that gunk over her mouth, silencing her. That would have gotten annoying. There was a round of nods that made Tayuya's twitch an eye in irritation. Suddenly Hibiki, who hadn't spoken since Tayuya had gotten there, looked up from where he had been concentrating. We should leave now, there are faint vibrations in the ground not far from here. Anbu are coming. The sound for and Sasuke nodded before taking off with Tayuya over Saken's shoulder and Hibiki leading the way. Tayuya tried to shout out insults and curses at her kidnappers, but with her mouth restrained all she managed were grunts and muffled noises. Eventually they stopped in a clearing. Saken was obviously annoyed by the girl's struggles and attempts at speaking. That's it, I don't care, let's just put them in the coffins now. Tayuya's eyes widened, wondering what the hell they meant by that. Sasuke also seemed interested, raising an eyebrow at the word, coffin. How is that supposed to give me more power? The Sound 4 merely laughed before Jirobo produced 2 pills from a pouch. The coffins merely keep you from hurting yourself. These are what activate the second stage of the curse mark. Sasuke narrowed his eyes at that but took the small pill anyway, quickly clambering into the rounded coffin before swallowing the pill. Jirobo quickly clamped on the lid and hefted the weighty coffin onto his back. Saken took the other pill and regarded Tayuya harshly whilst she stared at the pill in his hands with fury. Saken quickly ripped off the gunk from Tayuya's face and before the girl could utter a sound the man grasped her jaw, forced her mouth open and shoved the pill in. Tayuya went to immediately spit it out but Saken beat her to it, putting his hand over her nose and mouth so she couldn't breathe. Tayuya struggled for a few minutes but eventually her lungs demanded oxygen and she was forced to swallow. As soon as she did so Saken released her and she felt a burning sensation from her gut. Before it became too intense she was hoisted up and shoved into the second coffin they had brought. The lid came down with a thud and was quickly sealed into place. Tayuya felt blinding pain before passing out. Finally Kidomaru lifted the coffin and the Sound 4 took off again, hurrying to get back to their master in time. Naruto had caught up to Gaara and was happily chatting with his stoic friend when he suddenly dropped to his knees and grabbed his wrist in pain. Gaara could plainly see that the small petal mark imprinted on the blonde's wrist was glowing ominously. Naruto had to prevent himself from crying out in pain by biting down on his lip, drawing blood. Finally the pain passed and he stood up shakily, looking back and forth before his eyes settled on Gaara. Tayuya's in trouble. Naruto quickly took off with Gaara on his tail, both of their faces set in determined and serious masks as they quickly located the highest point in the area. Naruto stood on the tall tower and sniffed deeply in every direction, searching for some hint of Tayuya's location. He came up with nothing. She was in a crowd and he couldn't discern her scent or she had left the village. He really hoped it was the former. We should inform the Hokage and get help with this. As ever Gaara was the voice of reason in stressful situations and Naruto nodded lamely, following after him as they sprinted for the large building that dominated the village's skyline. It didn't take too long for the 2 Jinchuriki to reach the Hokage tower and before long they were brushing past the Hokage's secretary and bursting through her door. Tsunade looked at them over a stack of paperwork, immediately noting their very serious expressions. What is it, brat? Can't you see I have a stack of paperwork that's going to take all night to get through? Naruto just narrowed his eyes, not really giving a damn about a pile of meaningless sheets when his friend was in danger. Tayuya's in trouble and we need help finding her. Tsunade looked at him curiously. She had never seen Naruto this serious before. What kind of trouble, and how do you know? Naruto growled in irritation. He didn't have time to explain. I don't know what kind of trouble, that's why we need help. He would have slammed his hands down on the desk but there wasn't an inch of it not covered in various documents or forms. Look brat, I can't help you if you don't even know what the probable. She was interrupted as an Anbu suddenly appeared in the corner of the room. Lady Hokage, 4 Sound Ninja was seen fleeing the village with 1 Sasuke Uchiha and an unknown red-haired girl who appeared to be bound. Naruto's eyes shot open and he snarled visibly, already making for the door. Naruto wait. Begrudgingly he turned and took his hand off the door handle, looking at the youthful Hokage expectantly with barely concealed irritation. Tsunade turned to the Anbu who had the mask painted to give the impression of a dog. Give me more information. The Anbu nodded curtly. Our intel places the Sound Nin as the Sound 4, Orochimaru's elite bodyguards also responsible for the barrier seal that prevented us from helping the Sandaime. It would also appear that the Uchiha was not bound in any fashion, apparently leaving of his own free will. Tsunade nodded mulling the information over. How many Anbu are currently available? Even under the mask everybody could tell the Anbu was frowning. None Lady Hokage, all Anbu units are currently on missions or in their appropriate positions defending the village. Naruto snarled at that. If that was true then how did the foreign ninja even get into the village? Tsunade also grimaced at the news. There was a similar situation with the Junin as well. All were either with their squads or on missions. Round up available Chunin and Genin immediately. Have them in my office in 5 minutes. The Anbu nodded before vanishing from the room, leaving an irate Naruto who was subconsciously scratching the petal mark on his wrist. We don't have 5 minutes. They could be hurting Tayuya right now. Tsunade just turned to Naruto with the most understanding expression she could muster. Look Naruto, I know you care about your teammate but you heard that Anbu, they're Orochimaru's elite guards. You'll need some backup if you hope to take him on at all. Naruto growled but couldn't escape the woman's logic. He irritably paced the room as he waited for the Anbu to return with the other shinobi. He didn't, but the other recruits quickly appeared in the room. In the end, the only ones the Anbu could find on such short notice were Kiba, Lee, and Neji. They were quickly informed of the situation, although they were more concerned with Sasuke's defection than Tayuya's kidnapping, much to Naruto's annoyance. He did, however, idly notice that Lee and Neji were wearing their village's Chunin flak jackets, which meant that one of them would probably be leading the mission, considering he wasn't actually a shinobi of the leaf. Finally, they were all caught up and were running for the gates, quick to get on the kidnapper's trail. Naruto was impatient and kept pulling ahead of the group as they sprinted across the village, constantly having to be recalled by Gaara. Lee could keep up with him, but he didn't have the same sense of urgency as Naruto did, not to mention that every time he would try to run ahead, Neji would pull him back. As Naruto had thought, the previously stuck-up Hyuga had been put in command of the mission. They regrouped at the gates of the village, with Naruto impatiently looking back and forth, just waiting for them to give him the signal to go. Lee could sense his companion's eagerness and walked over, placing a firm hand on his back. "Don't worry, my friend, we shall retrieve your teammate and our wayward Sasuke, just you wait." The words irritated Naruto more than anything else, but he offered a fake smile just to get Lee to go away. Neji had them come around so he could draw out the plan, a waste of time in Naruto's opinion. He and Gaara could take these guys on without problem, and the others would just end up dragging them down. Normally Naruto would have appreciated the help, but he was agitated, and if he moved at full speed then only Lee might have been able to keep up. "Alright, we have no idea about the abilities of our opponents, therefore when we approach we should observe before we engage." Naruto growled at that but reluctantly nodded along with the rest of the group. "We should try and avoid getting separated if possible, but ultimately our objectives are the retrieval of Sasuke and Tayuya." Another round of nods from the assembled shinobi. "We will move out now in a spread-out formation to cover more ground, with Naruto and Kiba in the front as they can track our targets. Gaara and Lee will be a bit further behind them as support, and I will take up the rear to watch out for any traps or tricks the targets may leave for us." More nods quickly followed. "When we get closer we will slow down and assume a similar formation, with Kiba in the front, followed by Naruto, followed by Gaara, then Lee, and finally myself." After Neji waited for the nods, he motioned with his hand and the group was immediately off. Naruto was extremely frustrated as he raced through the trees. While Kiba was fast, he wasn't as fast as he was, and he had to limit himself to avoid getting ahead of the group. He and Gaara may have been a strong unit, but on his own he doubted being able to take on 4 possibly Junin-level shinobi. He wanted to turn around and tell the Inuzuka to get a move on, but he was more focused on locating Tayuya's scent, which proved to be highly difficult. Instead, he locked onto any unfamiliar scents that he could tell apart from the more natural smells of the forest. Eventually he caught something and took off in that direction, quickly followed by the rest of the group. A small amount of time later and Kiba confirmed his suspicions, also picking up the unfamiliar scent. Naruto was still concerned that he was unable to track Tayuya normally and couldn't help but worry what they had done to his girlfriend and teammate. After a few hours of tree hopping, the Sound 4 finally had to rest after lugging 2 heavy coffins on their backs for such a distance. Naruto grinned when he noticed this, but that quickly turned into a grimace when Neji ordered everybody to slow down and get into formation. They did so with a fair amount of muted complaining from the blonde, and they quietly approached the group. It wasn't difficult to avoid their traps with the aid of Neji's Byakugan. He even spotted the 3rd layer thanks to the trace chakra flowing through the strands of web-like substance. To this effect, they were able to creep up on their opponents undetected and all gathered around on a tree branch to watch what was happening. The Sound 4 just appeared to be resting against trees, catching their breaths after such a strenuous run. Naruto also noticed that Neji and Gaara also seemed slightly winded, while he, Kiba, and Lee all still seemed full of energy. They took a moment to observe their enemies to see what they could glean, quickly coming to the same assumptions that Tayuya had, not a few hours ago. Unfortunately, Kiba couldn't help the gasp he let out when he saw Hibiki amongst the group, wearing their uniform no less, alerting the 4 to their presence. Immediately the 4 had to dodge the webbing Kidomaru shot out, diving from the branch into the clearing, where they quickly took up a loose defensive formation. "Neji, where are Sasuke and Tayuya?" The Hyuga seemed to be concentrating extra hard on the group, his Byakugan flaring. "I think they're in the coffins." All the Konoha shinobi glanced at him curiously while not taking their eyes off the enemy who had yet to make a move. You think? It was Lee who had asked, although they were all thinking the same thing. There is something blocking my Byakugan to a degree. I think it's the seals on the coffins, but I can't tell. Only one of the group wasn't really listening. Hibiki, what are you doing with them? The brown-haired boy merely smirked at his former teammate, sneering at the yipping dog in his jacket. Please, I was a spy for Lord Orochimaru this whole time. You idiots of the Leaf never suspected a thing. Kiba growled menacingly, soon joined by both Akamaru and Naruto, who was more eyeing the two coffins. Hibiki, hold these clowns off, we still need to make it to Lord Orochimaru on time. The Tenketsu controlling boy nodded with a smile, still eyeing Kiba mockingly. The other members of the Sound Four had caught their breath and replaced the coffin on their backs before taking off. Naruto made a move to follow them but was cut off by Hibiki. He managed to dodge the rather clumsy strike but was still forced back. Fine Saito, you want to go again. I'll rip you to shreds for taking Tayuya. Naruto was about to make good on his promise when he felt a firm hand on his shoulder and looked back at Kiba with surprise. No, you guys go on. He looked at Hibiki with no small amount of disgust. I'll keep the traitor here busy. Naruto waited in a moment of indecision, however, upon seeing Kiba's determined but betrayed face, he nodded grimly, taking off with the rest of the group. Hibiki made a move to cut him off again, but he was sent flying back by a vicious kick from Kiba. Your fight is with me. Hibiki narrowed his eyes but smirked all the same. If that's what you want. Naruto spared a fleeting thought for Kiba as he ran on but quickly erased it and focused on the tree branches ahead of him. They were only a few minutes behind the targets and they were laden down, so the pursuing shinobi had the speed advantage. Of course they weren't expecting the ground in front of them to suddenly rise up into an enormous slab, forcing them to veer off to the side before it could descend and crush them. They regrouped as the dust settled, panting from the sudden attack. When the smoke finally cleared, they saw the largest of the Sound Four staring at them, smirking. Naruto narrowed his eyes, working out what the group was doing. They're trying to delay us. We need to get to the coffins quickly. The others in the group nodded their heads in agreement while Lee stepped towards Jirobo. I will keep our opponent busy and match my flames of youth against his. Naruto looked uncertain, but when Neji nodded at his teammate, Naruto couldn't argue. Fine then, but be careful, once you deal with him make sure to catch up. Lee nodded with an exuberant grin, raising a thumb towards his comrades as they sprinted off around the clearing, leaving Jirobo to face Lee. Ha, I won't even need my curse mark to deal with a pipsqueak like you. Lee just continued to smile as he settled into an offensive Gyuken stance, his hand raised out in front of him, palm up. Let us fight. Naruto noticed their numbers had dwindled and knew it couldn't stay like this or they would be weakened too much to help Tayuya. Unfortunately, he was distracted and managed to run headfirst into a large web that spanned two trees, instantly getting caught on its gooey surface. He managed to keep one of his arms from getting stuck, but before he could warn the others, they met a similar fate, each getting embarrassingly stuck like flies. The six-armed member of the group, Kidomaru, dropped down onto a branch facing all three stuck shinobi. Ha, it's almost too easy. It's not even surprising anymore how many people fall for a simple trap like that. Naruto struggled against his bonds but found them to be unbreakable, at least to him. Neji just seemed to be examining them with his Byakugan while Gaara had slowly leaked out and from his gourd and was currently doing something Naruto couldn't quite make out. It's impossible, that webbing is enhanced with chakra and you can't break it. Naruto caught the successive smirks from Neji and Gaara and figured they had found a way to escape. Not to be outdone, he summoned a kunai to his free arm and carefully launched it at the six-armed Sound Shinobi. Kidomaru just moved his head to the side, allowing the kunai to pierce the tree behind him, smiling amusedly. Is that the best you can do? I would expect a little better from Chunin. Naruto shrugged, or at least to the best of his ability while stuck like this. Kidomaru laughed again, but that instantly stopped when Naruto just vanished. His eyes opened wide in shock before a foot connected with the back of his head, sending him hurtling down to the forest floor below them. He managed to send out a web and swing onto the bough of a nearby tree, only to see Neji and Gaara standing across from him, also free. How? That's impossible. Both ninjas smirked, enjoying their opponent's confusion. Neji decided to explain first. Simple, with my Byakugan I could see the chakra flow in your webs. Using my Juoken style, it was simple to stop that flow, making it easy to cut with a finger strike. Kidomaru's eye twitched at the arrogant explanation as he looked across at Gaara. You aren't the only one with chakra-infused substances at your control. That was all the explanation he was going to give the enemy. It was pointless to give away all his abilities. Neji stood up on the branch, motioning with his hands to Gaara and Naruto. Go. I can deal with his webs easily now that I understand them. You two must rescue Tayuya and confront Sasuke. The two Suna shinobi nodded. The pattern was unbroken so far, so they saw no reason to do so now. Either way, there were two of them left and only one of the sound four. The blonde and the redhead took off, trusting in their companions to handle their respective fights. They had seen each one fight in the Chunin exams and all of them were more than capable. It would come down to just how dangerous their opponents turned out to be. It didn't take long to catch up to Sakin, who inexplicably seemed to have split into two people, the lump on his back vanishing. Each carried a different coffin, so were markedly slower than Naruto and Gaara. Even so, they managed to outpace them long enough to reach a large open field at the center of the forest. The blue-haired man and his double turned wearily, unable to outrun their pursuers any longer. They placed the coffins down and turned to face Naruto and Gaara as the temporary leaf nin dropped into the clearing themselves. There's nowhere left to run. Both Sakins grinned at their opponents, turning to one another. You hear that, Akon? They think we were running. Funny, isn't it, brother? They just walked right into our trap like good little idiots. Naruto seethed at the flippant conversation between the two sound shinobi. Shut up and fight so we can kick your asses and take Tayuya back. Sakin and Akon chuckled as they glanced at the containers behind them. Oh brother, I do think the little leaf nin are too late. The other one nodded happily. I do think you're right, brother. Oh well, would you look at that. Sure enough, the coffins behind them began to spew an acrid purple smoke that drifted across the ground like dry ice. What are you doing to Tayuya? The brothers smirked again. He wants to know about stage 2, Akon. Maybe we should show them Sakin. Two large grins split the brothers' features as they finally turned around and dropped into a fighting stance and spoke simultaneously. This ought to be fun. Kiba glared across at Hibiki, trying to get all of his anger and betrayal across in that single look, to which the sound spy merely smirked. It had amused him every day that the people around him actually believed he was befriending them, unknowingly giving him information and even training to better his goals. The best part had been fooling his sensei. For such a high-level Junin to fall for his charade for so long was bordering on plain sad. Why would you do this, Hibiki? The average-seeming boy glanced around with an air of superiority and arrogance. Why the hell wouldn't I? He leveled a more serious gaze on his former friend. You could never understand with your family and normal life. Lord Orochimaru saved me, he saved all of us. He gave us meaning and purpose where before we had none. He gave our very lives existence with one simple request, our total obedience. We became tools, sure, but at least we were something for once, as opposed to orphans left on the side of roads for dead. Kiba snarled, the sob story not really getting to him through his veil of anger. It doesn't matter what kind of life you had. Nothing is worth selling your soul to that snake bastard. Hibiki's fist shook for a moment as he suppressed a moment of rage before returning his gaze to something more neutral. Like I said, you would never understand the pain of losing your entire family, of being thrown aside by everybody you used to call friend. Kiba settled into his offensive taijutsu stance, smirking as his usual confident air replaced his anger as his fight reflexes kicked in. You're right, I don't understand because I do have a family, one I'll be going back to after I hand you your ass. Hibiki growled, his hands opening and closing in fists as he readied his chakra network for his complex ability. Kiba recognized this after so long of training with the boy and decided he couldn't let him prepare or stall any longer. Kiba launched himself at Hibiki much in the same way he had Sasuke in the preliminaries, the only difference being he was now much faster. After seeing what Lee could do, Kiba had decided to experiment with weights, and while he was only in the early stages of the training, the results were promising. His strength and speed were vastly improved past his usual family's training standards, shocking both his mother and his sister. It was enough that they actually began experimenting with adding the weights to the normal aspect of their family taijutsu. Of course, they didn't go to the extreme of always wearing the weights, something like that could prove more detrimental than helpful. He smirked at the results firsthand when he managed to shock Hibiki and drive a fist squarely into the boy's gut, making the traitor double over from the blow. Kiba tried to follow up with his claw-like nails but only passed through Hibiki as he vibrated out of harm's way. Kiba had seen how Naruto dealt with that problem, but Hibiki had made adjustments to that style. When Kiba would try to keep his body occupying the same space as Hibiki's blurred form, the boy would dodge or jump out of the way before retaliating with a swift and vicious counter. It was a brutally efficient and dangerous style, one that Kiba actually found himself hard-pressed to overcome. Nearly all of his strikes were rendered completely useless, and those that did hit made him come away with burns to his fists. He backed off a bit, giving him time to think, not an activity Kiba usually took a part of in the middle of the fight. He had sparred a few times with Hibiki over the months, but only now it was becoming apparent just how much he had been holding back. We got fairly close over these past few months, wouldn't you say, Kiba? The Inuzuka narrowed his eyes, recognizing that the boy was stalling for time, both for his teammate Sake and to catch his breath. His vibration technique was now second nature, but it was still relatively chakra-consuming when used in short succession like he had been forced to. A growl was all the answer he received, making the brown-haired boy smirk from the emotional rise he was getting. I'll take that as a yes. As such, I've decided I'll end this quickly. Kiba growled again as he saw Hibiki split into two clones, both as real as each other and twice as dangerous. I never could take that annoying blonde's advice and learn the shadow clones, but I did decide to upgrade my own moves a bit. Kiba watched in hidden amazement as the two Hibikis split apart again, so here were now four in a line in front of Kiba. What do you think? His voice had taken on a somewhat buzzing quality due to the intense vibrations his body was being put through. Kiba wondered how this was even physically possible. Then in a world where people could walk on water and form clones out of thin air, he decided to just go with it and focus on not dying. Man-beast clone. Kiba threw a Kamaru out of his jacket in time for the small dog to puff out into a ball of smoke, only to reappear as a perfect duplicate of himself. Come on boy, that's two each. His doppelganger yipped in agreement, a strange sight coming from what was supposed to be a feral-looking teenage boy. Hibiki just chuckled in his static-filled voice, and all four of them dropped down into a solid taijutsu stance as markings reminiscent of lightning began to move across his face. Lee dodged underneath another heavy swing from the surprisingly fast Jirobo as the man roared out in annoyance yet again at his swift opponent. As hard as the man tried, he couldn't land one of his devastating blows on the spandex-wearing taijutsu protege. One hit would be all it took, but he couldn't even manage that much. Luckily for the ginger giant, his opponent so far had merely dodged all his attacks. While I admit your fighting is most youthful and energetic indeed, I must disagree with your methods of kidnapping a woman such as the fair Tayuya. I am honor-stricken to do everything in my power to save such a damsel in distress, so I wish you a good fight. Satisfied with his opening monologue, Lee grinned wildly as he flipped back from the muscular man and landed with the grace honed from years of intense training. Hold still, you twig, so I can crush you and that stupid bowl haircut. Lee's eye twitched a little at the comment, but his form remained flawless. I must have you know that my hair is based off of the handsome devil of the Leaf Village, Guy Sensei, and I will not have you insult him. Jirobo seemed a little confused by that, hesitating in taking a step, which was all the opening Lee required. He zipped out of existence just faster than the sound Nin's eyes could follow and appeared in front of him. Leaf Hurricane. Jirobo felt a strong spinning kick impact with his stomach, and as he moved to defend against the next attack, he felt the boy try to sweep his legs out from under him. Unfortunately for Lee, it was like kicking a boulder, an exercise he had done many times, but that still didn't mean he could move it. Jirobo retaliated by grabbing Lee, or he would have if Lee hadn't used the opportunity to slip out from his guard through his legs. He delivered two swift and strong kicks to the back of Jirobo's knees. The areas were weaker than the rest of his legs, so Lee finally felt some give. Before he could capitalize, his opponent turned and once again tried to grab him, only for the nimble Leaf Nin to backflip away. Jirobo seemed more and more irritated as the seconds shifted by, and in his impatience he drove his hands into the ground and literally dragged up a chunk of earth roughly the same size as himself. He threw the mighty boulder straight at Lee, who, much to his opponent's surprise, made no move to dodge the potentially fatal attack. Instead, the boy raised his leg up in the air with unbelievable flexibility before bringing it down on top of the boulder as soon as it came into range. The power behind the kick, supplemented by the heavy weights around Lee's ankles, served to drive the earth back into the ground where it came from, creating a small screen of unsettled dust from the impact. When it all finally settled, the two fighting ninja were right back to where they started, Jirobo standing across from Lee in his confident opening position. The behemoth of a man roared out in annoyance as arrows spread out from his shoulder, covering his face in intricate patterns that Lee observed for a moment with a grin. Very well, if you believe we can move on to the next stage of outfight, we shall. Jirobo looked confused as Lee bent over to remove his ankle weights, both at once. Having been noticeably absent from the Chunin exam finals, he was thoroughly surprised at the size of the craters left behind when Lee dropped the enormous loads. Jirobo's eyes widened slightly before returning to their original scowling position. Is that all you got, kid? Wait. That's not going to be enough to beat M. He had to cut off his own sentence as he felt a kick like a steel bar smack across his face, sending the irate giant across the field. Lee just stood where he had been, bobbing slightly with a grin on his face. Most youthful indeed. Neji spun around, his Byakugan working overtime as every finger strike found its target in the form of the multitudes of spiders swarming down on him. The enormous queen above him glared at him with her 8 dead eyes, scowling if such a thing were possible for arachnids. He looked up at Kidomaru, now adorned with the black swirling patterns of his curse marks stage 1. Neji cursed at what he thought would have been a much easier fight, and would have been without that bastardized Fuinjutsu. He panted for breath as he finished of the last of the spiders, the webs they used to descend still hanging like thin, silvery willow branches. He refused to show weakness in front of his opponent by resting his hands on his knees, but even so the exhaustion of this fight was beginning to wear on him. He caught a second wind as he looked up to see the next wave of the spider summons swarming down on him from above. Byakugan. Kiba and Akamaru were back to back, dodging, weaving and blocking only when absolutely necessary. There were burn marks along his arms that screamed out for attendance and treatment, but he gritted his elongated teeth and fought through the pain. Every time he aimed a kick or a punch, he would try and get Hibiki right between where his two bodies were flickering between. Every time the boy would miraculously dodge without even having to move that much. It was 4 against 2 and Kiba felt the pressure on him as Akamaru finally ran out of juice and puffed back into his real form behind him. The young Inuzuka disguised a spinning axe kick and dropped down to the ground, throwing down a smoke bomb he had managed to scavenge from his pocket at some point during the fight. Drilling Fang. When the acrid purple smoke finally cleared, the Hibikis could clearly see the human-sized tunnel dug directly into the ground. A few seconds later, Kiba emerged from the ground a dozen feet away, spraying earth and mud around as his drilling body burst from the soil. He shook it off in the manner best befitting a clan who shared qualities with dogs before looking back over at Hibiki, trying to judge the boy's next attack. The average-looking boy proved hard to read as his 4 clones merged back into 2 before finally a lone Hibiki stood across from Kiba. The Inuzuka pulled out 2 specialized soldier pills from his jacket, feeding one to Akamaru and popping the other in his own mouth to gain back the chakra and energy they had both spent. Akamaru's features grew wilder and less domestic as his coat shifted from its usual pure white to a more intimidating red. Don't think we're done yet, Hibiki. The other boy just glanced back with an amused expression. I would hope not. Kiba grimaced as his ex-friend managed to get under his skin again before throwing Akamaru back onto the ground. Man-beast clone. Hibiki just sighed at the reused technique and moved into his own stance, ready to split apart again. Fang over Fang. The last jutsu caught the traitor off guard as the Kibas suddenly erupted into human, and canine, drills. They charged right at him in perfect tandem to what would usually be a fatal or at least severely debilitating attack. While still mildly surprised that Kiba was still able to pull off such a taxing technique, Hibiki sighed again. When the spinning duo approached, Hibiki began his own spin, rapidly expelling chakra from the tenketsu in only one side of his body, quickly propelling his boy around in a move not dissimilar from Neji's rotation. The 2 drill-like Kibas bounced harmlessly off the spinning sound nin, ricocheting off him to bounce of the trees that bordered the clearing. They springboarded off of the trunks and tried to return and perform the same move as they had before, only to get the same results. This repeated a few times as Hibiki continued his impromptu rotation technique while Kiba and Akamaru bounced around the clearing, unable to harm him. Finally Kiba had to stop, the stress of the technique too much for him as he nearly collapsed to the ground across from Hibiki. He was quickly joined by his equally exhausted pup, now back to his rightful snowy white as they both lay breathless on the ground. Hibiki slowed down his own jutsu to a stop, looking a little dizzy but not much worse off. He smirked at his nearly defeated opponents and calmly began to walk over, only for Kiba to weakly raise his head. Hey Saito, I bet you don't have enough chakra to do that clone technique again. Hibiki glared furiously at the boy. Despite his near defeat, he was still able to try and mock his attacker. Hibiki just stared at him more viciously while smirking to himself. He guessed he could do it as a last request for a dead man. His body vibrated rapidly and quickly split into two people, both approaching Kiba with menace in their eyes. Kiba just chuckled and pulled out a single kunai from the pouch at his waist, holding it in trembling and exhausted hands. Really, Kiba? You're that desperate? Kiba chuckled once again, earning increased levels of hatred from the approaching traitor. The downed Inuzuka stared at the simple piece of steel for a moment before flicking it as hard as he could between Hibiki's blurred forms. Of course, it just passed harmlessly through, allowing the other boy to let out a victorious laugh as he once again took to staring at the panting boy with arrogance. Pathetic. I don't even have to resort to stage 2. Well, if that's all you have, Kiba, then that's as far as he got before Kiba tugged at the wire in his hand, pulling it taut from the kunai embedded in the tree across the clearing. The last thing Hibiki saw was the flash of light reflecting off the metal wire before darkness. Kiba finally let out a long sigh as he laid his head back against the grass. Darkness crept up on his vision as he contemplated the clouds above him, wondering for a moment what Shikamaru saw in them before succumbing to exhaustion and passing out. Later on, the Anbu and medical shinobi would come across the strange scene of a severely chakra-exhausted boy in a fur-trimmed jacket, a dog proudly perched on his chest. The battlefield itself was a mess of burns, craters and a large but thin tunnel that was slowly collapsing on itself. To top it off, the legs of another shinobi could be seen lying on the floor, the respective torso a few feet away from it. Right now, all that was keeping Jirobo alive and not a small pummeled mass on the ground was his extraordinary durability. Lee's blows came too fast and too unpredictably for the giant to see or effectively counter, rendering him unable to return the flurry of rock-hard blows that rained down on his muscled body. Occasionally he would catch a brief glimpse of green only to have it disappear and the back of his head smacked with the force of a small boulder. Jirobo's patience grew incredibly thin as Lee appeared again a few dozen feet away, not even looking remotely winded while Jirobo was covered in bruises. He wasn't majorly hurt, but if the fight continued in this fashion, then he would slowly be worn down until he was just a vaguely human-shaped stain on the ground. You have lasted much longer than I thought. Your flames of youth must surely burn bright, but I must ask if you are now willing to surrender peacefully before I am forced to take more drastic precautions. Jirobo grimaced. He didn't really want to find out what those drastic precautions were if everything so far had just been the warm-up. He grunted as the arrow markings on his face distorted and spread to the rest of his body. His skin became the same color, red as dried blood, while his hair grew wilder in the places it still grew at all. Certain areas of his body became blotchy and deformed as swellings and lumps appeared to highlight his hideous change. Imperceptibly his muscles expanded, increasing his already intimidating presence by a few inches. Lee decided to test out what this new form of Jirobo's brought and blurred forward faster than the normal human eye could detect. Luckily for the red giant, his eyes were now far from human, and as Lee's foot swung out for the man's face, he caught it in a crushing embrace. He held onto the ankle he had caught with one hand, slowly increasing the pressure by closing his fist. Before his lower leg could be completely crushed, Lee twisted his body and lashed out with his free foot, catching the transformed Soundnin in the mouth with barely phased him physically but was enough of a shock for Jirobo to let Lee go. Lee backed off on his hands, feeling his injured ankle would hurt too much to put pressure on right now. He twisted and stared at his opponent, glaring at him but at the same time excited by the challenge this man brought. He hopped back so the world was the right way up, only balancing on his uninjured leg as he once again evaluated his opponent. The man was now much stronger with better reflexes and was most likely faster as well. Lee just narrowed his eyes and smirked to himself. He would just have to be even faster. Gate of opening, open. Chakra began swirling menacingly around Lee and Jirobo stared at him, wondering what was going on. Gate of healing, open. The chakra picked up as Lee's body tensed and the floor around him began to crack. Jirobo didn't like where this was going and began to move forward before his opponent could finish whatever he was doing. Gate of life, open. The chakra now swirled like a small maelstrom as Lee began to develop a glow around his body seemingly of pure chakra. He let up there, not wanting to overdo it and completely blow out his muscles like his sensei told him. He clenched his fists and the simple action caused the ground beneath him to crack even more before his disappeared into thin air. In the time it might have taken Jirobo to blink, he felt a tremendous force slamming into him from below, unbelievably lifting his weighty body from the floor. This happened 3 more times, slamming him more and more painfully into the air like he could fly. He was unable to retaliate in any way as he flailed madly in the air, trying to find purchase that he knew wasn't there. Lee suddenly appeared above him, his eyes void of pupils, just white globes that stared at him like the Shinigami itself. Jirobo got one good look seared into his memory forever before Lee spun in the air, viciously slamming his uninjured foot down into Jirobo's body with the force of a train. The crater he created upon impact was huge, his own weight plus the force of the blow enough to leave him deep in the ground. The crater only widened when Lee followed up on his attack in a straight dive bomb onto Jirobo's chest. Even through his curse mark he felt the ribs crack from that strike. He was unable to heal even a little before the action was repeated, 4 times. Finally Jirobo groaned out as the markings receded back into his mark while the man himself was blissfully unconscious. Lee stood over his latest opponent with a smile. He was slowly getting more used to the effects the gates had on his body. Fairly soon he hoped to match his sensei and open the 6th gate while being nearly unaffected by the first 5. Right now he felt the ache from his overworked muscles, but it was more the equivalent of an entire day's strenuous training. He thanked his sensei for such rigorous routines before jogging off into the forest, certain that his opponent would not be getting up. He still had to help his friends if he could. Neji stopped himself from screaming out when the large arrow pierced through his chest, guided at the last moment to prevent a wound being fatal. He gasped for a moment before he was able to right himself and focus on the thread leading away into the trees. He grabbed the webbing, focusing on it before his body could succumb to its injuries as he directed chakra up through it, straight into the mouth of his deformed opponent. He rushed the multi-armed archer before he could recover, delivering blow after chakra-sealing blow into the man's unprotected chest. With each strike he felt his own body failing him, but he carried on through the pain until with a gasp he was able to call out. 64 palms. Kidomaru flew back from the strike, if not dead then severely wounded. Neji smiled up at the sky for a moment, realizing that he had done it. He had proved the people who called him a genius right. He had earned the name now and was allowed to finally let the pain that threatened to overwhelm him come crashing down like a flood. His last waking thought as he fell backwards onto the ground was a flash of green and a familiar black bowl cut. He was already unconscious by the time 2 arms firmly stopped him from hitting the floor. Naruto and Gaara were still focused on the 2 identical brothers before them, but as usual Gaara was letting no moment go to waste and was already sifting his sand through the earth. Sakan and Akon seemed to be playing with them more than anything else, bantering between themselves as they leant on their respective coffins dangerously, as if they would just reach in and snap the occupant's neck at a moment's notice, which Naruto figured was the idea. Well brother, I do believe the process is nearly finished. Yes, I remember our time in the coffin. Most painful if I remember right. His brother nodded along with him, further enraging Naruto. Give me back Tayuya or I will rip you 2 to shreds. Both brothers put a hand over their mouths in mock shock and indignation. Really brother, the rudeness on this one. I know, it is sometimes so difficult to find civility in shinobi these days. Again the brothers shared a sympathetic nod as Sakan turned to the 2 seriously, capturing their attention. Besides, I don't even think it's possible for us to be ripped into shreds. You see, the Kekkei Genkai we share allows us to sift our own molecules through those of our targets or really any solid object. A devious smile enveloped the androgynous man's face. Isn't that right brother? Both Gaara and Naruto looked across only to start in shock when they noticed Akon was nowhere to be seen. They heard an ominous cackling from somewhere suspiciously close to Gaara as the 2 desperately looked around for any sign of the wayward enemy. Oh please, you'll never find my brother. Looking around, again a smirk developed on his green-painted lips. You'll have to look a bit more inward. The man chuckled at his own joke before they heard that same cackling, this time seemingly from where Gaara was standing. To both of their shock, Yukon's head appeared to melt out of Gaara's shoulder like his body was nothing more than water. I've never inhabited a Jinchuriki before. Akon frowned from his position inside of Gaara, his molecules spread out through the boy's form. They feel like, he was frankly cut off as a gravely shout came from the forest behind them. Sand burial. Yukon's and Sakan's eyes both widened in panic as the body Akon was inhabiting suddenly lost its color, instead becoming grainy and beige. Immediately the sand clone detonated, exploding outwards, taking Akon and his molecule-sifting body with it. Sakan just stared wide-eyed at where the clone had been standing before glaring at Gaara as he emerged from the forest, fist still held out in front of him, clenched tightly. You killed my brother. Gaara's eyes narrowed at the last of the sound, pointing out the obvious. I'm sorry, would you have liked to go first? The deadpan tone with which Gaara spoke only increased the menace behind his words. Sakan's eyes darted dangerously back and forth, caught between terror and righteous fury for his brother's murderer. I'll kill you for that. However, despite the words, the pale man didn't move an inch in his muscles. Gaara began to raise his hand again while sand drained out of the ground, quickly forming into a small uneven ball in front of him. He hoped to use this moment of indecision and cowardice to his advantage. They had pissed him off by kidnapping Tayuya. Sand bullets. From the floating ball, little pebble-sized chunks of sand flew out at frightening velocities, straight at Sakan's frozen form. He was only saved as a tall pale man suddenly dropped down from the sky and stood right in the way of the attack. The bullets merely punctured the man's skin without penetrating the inexplicable layer of solid bone beneath. Kimimaro, what are you doing here? The pale man turned to his teammate, staring at him with emotionless, cold eyes. Lord Orochimaru grew impatient with waiting. I have come to serve him by giving the vessel time to complete the process. Kimimaro leveled an equally cold and blank look at Naruto and Gaara. And if that requires the removal of these two, then so be it. Behind him, Sakan shook his head, looking at his teammate in worry. But Kimimaro, your illness. The glare the tall man leveled at Sakan was far from cold that time. I live to serve Lord Orochimaru, and if it requires the sacrifice of my own life, then I will do so gladly. Naruto and Gaara took in this entire scene somewhat impassively, wondering where this new guy had come from and what his abilities were. Naruto had just seen him survive a near point-blank range sand bullet. That attack was enough to break bones usually. There was also that body armor they had seen. Naruto could have sworn it was actually bone, but bone wasn't that tough. He narrowed his eyes as the two sound nin finally finished their conversation and Sakan took off, fleeing from Naruto and his brother's murderer to the relative safety of Orochimaru. Naruto couldn't have cared less, honestly. He hadn't taken the coffin, so Naruto was more than happy to focus on the pale, lanky one until he could rescue Tayuya. Gaara, we should make this quick. That other guy might be going for reinforcements. Gaara nodded to him, which the blonde Jinchuriki caught from the corner of his eye as he didn't want to take his attention from Kimimaro. You two should flee while you can. Nobody has ever survived my dances before. In any other situation, Naruto might have laughed from the absurdity of a shinobi telling his opponent they were about to defeat them with a dance. He knew that sometimes specialized kenjutsu styles are names after dances, but Naruto couldn't see a sword on the man's person. He thought it might have something to do with that strange armor ability, but he hoped not. He was finally tired of waiting and dropped into his four-legged stance, Gaara just impassively crossing his arms, looking almost as bored as Kimimaro. I will warn you only one more time, do not fight me or you will die. Naruto snorted. The man was about to face two Jinchuriki. He had no idea what was about to hit him. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.